Hello and welcome to the 2021 presentation of Giving USA. My name's Dan Sharp, Vice President for Community Research and Grants Management at the Columbus Foundation, and we are delighted to have you with us today for this virtual presentation. For more than 60 years, Giving USA has been the go-to source for philanthropic data and insight into the sector. And this presentation is no different, especially as we look back on 2020, a year full of programmatic pivots and philanthropic pivots. And to bring this presentation to you, we would not be here if it weren't for a tremendous amount of collaboration. So I'd like to take a point of privilege and thank especially the Giving Institute board members who reside in Central Ohio and play a pivotal role in this year's presentation. And that would be Laura McDonald of Benefactor Group, Michelle Kramer of Kramer and Associates, and Russ Hodge of Hodge and Associates. So thank you very much for your role, and a huge hearty thank you to all of our other presenting partners that made today possible. A moment of housekeeping before we really get to the meat of the program. Do want to share that this session is going to be recorded, which is currently underway, so that we can utilize it as a point of record, but have it be accessible to folks that weren't able to join us live for this presentation. By default, all attendees are muted and hidden, meaning camera off, and that's with the exception of the interpreter partners that are with us today. And if you're interested in utilizing the closed caption feature or the live transcript feature, please do find that in the bottom right by selecting live transcript and show subtitles. We do have two functions that might be of use to you today, and we are utilizing them differently, so want to delineate that for you. The question and answer feature and the chat feature. If you have technical difficulties or kind of need to reach an administrator, please use the chat feature. And if you have a question for the panelists and presenters, feel free to use the Q&A function at any time during today's presentation, and we will be sure to address those, especially during the Q&A session. After this event, some resources will be sent to you, most likely through the Eventbrite platform, so please keep an eye for that. And now I am pleased to hand over the Zoom tile to Dawn Robinson, Vice President at Kramer and Associates, to introduce our next speaker. Thank you to everybody, and thank you, Dawn.
Thank you, Dan. And I'm happy to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Una Osili. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Una Osili, Efremson Chair in Philanthropy and Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at the Lilly School of Philanthropy, the world's first school who is dedicated to increasing the understanding of philanthropy. Una also serves as Dean's Fellow for the Mays Family Institute on Diverse Philanthropy. Dr. Osili is an economist with significant experience in research and policies in the field of household behavior and economic policy. She's an internationally recognized scholar in economics. She leads the research and publications of Global Philanthropy Tracker and the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, which are prominent sources of global development and social innovation data trends that collaborate with over 100 experts in over 79 countries. She has provided expert testimony at the Joint Economic Commission and United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. She is a consultant with the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago and has worked on cross-sector initiatives on financial inclusion. At IU, she leads the research and publication of Giving USA, the annual report on American philanthropy, and it's the founder of the Generosity for Life, a digital platform providing new data tools for financial decision-making in the area of philanthropy and social impact. Thank you, Una, for being here today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Una Osili.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dawn, for that generous introduction. Thank you, the Columbus Foundation, and thank you, Laura McDonald, who has been a longtime collaborator. It is such a pleasure to join you all. I wish that we could have done this in person this year. It is always a pleasure and an honor to be in Columbus to present this data. It is a really exciting time for all of us involved in the project, but I also want to ask everyone in the audience today to join us in a virtual celebration. Producing this report, as you know, involves a lot of collaboration, a lot of hard work, but also a lot of inspiration. And every year we get to observe not just what happened in our corner of the globe, but also to see how those results played out across the United States. And here I'd like to start by sharing some of these slides, but also invite all of you throughout this presentation to send in your questions, to send in your comments. We'd love to hear from you. And I will go through and start to share my screen right away. This year, we have a new high water mark for giving. I'm going to start the presentation. By sharing the big picture. In 2021, giving across all of the donor types, individuals, foundations, charitable bequests, and corporations reached a new record of $471.44 billion. Giving grew at a rate of 5.1% measured in current dollars and adjusted for inflation, that was a 3.8%. Behind these numbers, there's a tremendous story of innovation, resilience, and collaboration. And all of us, I think, in this year's report, we did not know what to expect. And it's worth noting that nearly all sources of giving saw an increase. Individual gifts rose by $7 billion. New areas of giving were opened up. Foundations also achieved their largest share on record at 19%. Behind these numbers, we also know that foundations stepped up in their generosity, provided new models of giving. For example, we saw more unrestricted giving, more investments in new areas, and impact investing on a scale that we haven't seen before. Charitable bequests also increased their slice of the pie, and corporations raise their voices to speak out against racial injustice in 2020. So this pie chart represents tremendous work in the sector to achieve this new record. At the same time, we also know that there are challenges ahead, and in many communities across the country, individuals, businesses, and institutions are still dealing with the aftermath of an economic crisis, a racial justice crisis, and as we continue to look ahead, a health crisis. So I want to celebrate this work today, but also encourage us to go out there and continue to do the collaboration, the innovation, and the resilience that made 2020 and these results possible. Now let's talk about where all the giving went. Now, on this map, those of you who followed the Giving USA data over time will note that religion still occupies the lion's share of American philanthropy at 28%. But it's worth noting that these numbers look very different from what they looked like in the 50s and the 60s, 70s, and even the 1980s. This is a very low share of religious giving compared to what we've seen in the past. We've also witnessed in the past year gifts that have gone to new areas of giving. I lifted up racial and social justice that doesn't necessarily fall into this pie chart here, but represented a new area of giving and actually is found in all these different areas. In particular, we saw large gifts made to historically Black colleges and universities, a lot of umbrella organizations working on the front lines of equity and housing, and many other areas that have not received support in the past. So although this pie chart may look relatively similar, there's tremendous innovation taking place in philanthropy. And we who have been watching and tracking this data very much feel like we are at an inflection point in the philanthropic sector where new ideas are possible. we've been able to see the role that technology can play. And many of us realize that even as the economy opens up, vaccines become more widely available, and many of us are returning to in-person events and work, it is no longer possible to go back to business as usual. We need to approach our work in the philanthropic sector with an urgency of mission, but also a sense of possibility, knowing that we were able to achieve these results in a very challenging environment, and there is more work that lies ahead. So let us take you quickly through the top 6 findings. Every year, our team combs through the data, looks at all the findings, and we come up with the top 10. But because we have a time constraint this morning and a very dynamic panel presentation ahead, I had to discipline myself and find just the top 6 findings. And I'd like to go through these very quickly and then open it up for some questions. So let's start with the number 1 finding. The number 1 finding for 2020 is that giving achieved a new record. In addition to achieving this new record, we also saw an expansion in generosity. Across all the various forms of giving, we did see many donors step up. In terms of their giving, we saw new donors come to the table to support COVID relief, but also a lot of other related economic issues. And as I mentioned, the social justice and racial equity causes. Now, let's also compare what this map looks like today and where it was in 1980. So dial back, and when we compare where we are as a sector with where we were in 1980, I'll just mention a few high-level points. First, individual giving is still the most important source of philanthropy. It was the case in 1980, it is still the case. The message to all of you is the power of individuals. All of us play a critical role in making the changes that we need to make in our communities, but also in demonstrating generosity. And we saw that in 2020, we've seen that before. What has changed, however, is the growing role of the foundation sector. In the 1980s, foundations only accounted for 6% of giving. Today, that slice is almost up to 20%. What has changed is that we have more foundations than we did certainly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s. There has been tremendous growth in the foundation sector. But in this past year, we've also seen foundations as a source of innovation in the sector. And that includes community foundations, family foundations, and larger foundations as well. In terms of where else we're seeing change take place, charitable bequests have also increased. And this is also, I guess, a big opportunity for many organizations to start to look at their ability to engage donors around planned giving with our aging population in the United States and many other parts of the globe. Individuals are starting to think about their legacy and their opportunities for planned giving. Corporate giving, surprisingly, I think to many, has stayed at about 4 to 5% of overall giving, despite all the changes we've seen in the corporate sector. While this 5% or 4% seems relatively stable, there's tremendous flux within corporate giving, with an expansion in workplace giving programs, matching gifts, corporate sponsorships, cause marketing, and corporations increasingly using their platforms to raise awareness about the environment, about racial equity, and about social justice. So the more things change, I think in the Giving USA landscape, it's also an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into these numbers. Now let's go to the second finding. What made the results of 2020 possible? I want to highlight that 2020 was a truly unprecedented year, with many factors contributing to the results we saw. A pandemic on a scale that we have never seen before in our own lifetimes. We'd have to go back 100 years to 1918, 1920 to see anything that was even remotely comparable. Every community was impacted, and we did see, as I mentioned, all aspects of the economy transformed as many Americans moved to remote working and had to contend with a health crisis of untold proportions. In addition to the health and economic crisis, and cascading needs in many parts of the United States. We had the growth of a racial equity and social justice movement that continues even in 2021. And then finally, I want to stress that towards the end of 2020, we did have an economic recovery. The actions of the federal government, specifically with the PPP program and the stimulus dollars, did lead many businesses and individuals to start to recover their economic and financial foothold, and a very strong stock market performance, especially at the year end, led many Americans to feel economically and financially secure and invest in the philanthropic institutions and causes that matter to them. So 2020 was a complex year. There's a lot to unpack. And as we look ahead, 2021, I just want to mention many of us are watching the economic fundamentals. We are expecting a recovery. In fact, most of the projections show that GDP will increase and has increased so far this year. And note that for 2020, GDP ended the year on a negative note. However, the stock market grew significantly in 2020, a very high rate of growth, only comparable in recent years to 2013. And personal disposable income also grew. Many Americans were in a position to give while they were working remotely. They had the ability to accumulate savings. They were not spending as much. In other words, they had more disposable income. So I want to encourage all of you who are working with donors to recognize that this is still a very favorable environment to engage American households. Many are in a position to give. They have accumulated savings, and they are very interested in and motivated to make a difference in the communities where they live. At the same time, I also want to encourage all of us to recognize that pockets of our economy, pockets of our communities are still dealing with the aftermath of the crisis, and there is incredible need and incredible opportunity to make a difference. Looking at 2020, if you put all the results together, and I want to mention the contributions that our Giving USA partners have made to this question, including Laura McDonald. Over the past few decades, we've noted that philanthropy has grown. The sector now has a level of complexity and sophistication. We have more than 1.3 million nonprofits in the United States, and almost 13% of the workforce employed in the nonprofit sector. What we've also seen is that although philanthropy has grown, the visibility of the sector has grown. When we measure the share of philanthropy in GDP, it stayed at roughly 2%. So it stayed relatively flat. And the question we often pose is, what would we all have to do differently in order to raise this bar? Now, here in 2020, we did reach a new high water mark with 2.3% of GDP allocated to the philanthropic sector. But this occurred primarily because GDP actually declined. So what I'd like to pose to all of you is a call to action. How do we continue to build on the generosity that was experienced and witnessed in 2020 and build our economies in a way that is more inclusive, and so that there's growth, so more Americans have the means and the resources to give, and that there is incredible opportunity to support that generosity of all Americans. Now, going to the third finding, and I know we have, so we're almost there. 3 out of the 4 sources grew. The only segment of the philanthropic sector that did not grow in 2020 was the corporate sector. This may come as a bit of a surprise to many of you in the audience, but not such a surprise when you recognize that corporations are impacted by the overall economic environment, and corporate profits declined in 2020. So while some segments of the corporate sector had strong earnings reports in 2020, especially the tech sector, a large swath of the corporate sector was impacted by the adverse impacts of COVID and the cascading economic crisis. Going forward, however, we're starting to see recovery across nearly all segments of the corporate landscape. Parts of the economy that faltered in 2020 have started to rebound. And so I think it's quite promising if you are thinking of engaging corporations heading into 2021. In terms of variables to watch, especially in 2021, I would say if you had to pick one variable, the stock market continues to be a strong indicator of giving. Over time, we've seen that charitable giving is closely linked with the performance of the stock market. It also serves as a bit of a barometer for many Americans. People give when they feel economically and financially secure. And we do know that the stock market is a bit of a, you could say, a variable that comes first. In other words, giving tends to be a lagging indicator. The stock market has to improve first before individuals give. And so as you look ahead to 2021, the stock market is certainly a variable to continue to pay attention to. Now let's turn our attention to the fourth finding, and this looks more at where all the giving went. Here again, we have a good news story. Across 7 of the 9 areas that we track in giving, we saw that giving grew. And giving grew by more than 8% in 5 areas. And I want to lift up some of those areas. Public society benefits, so that includes umbrella organizations like United Ways, United Jewish Appeals, but also we saw tremendous growth in education and human services and the environment. 2 areas of giving had a more challenging year. Arts and culture, I'll lift up because we did know that many arts organizations were constrained in their ability to fundraise, in their ability to engage donors, but also in their ability to deliver on their mission with orchestras, performing arts centers, museums closed. Many organizations had to pivot, and that was the operative word of 2020. And we know that even now, as things start to open up, many arts organizations are still struggling. The arts organizations, especially knowing the Columbus community, play a vital role in the strength and the health of our economic and civic life. And so we're starting to see many donors return, not just to donating to the arts, but also wanting to engage with the arts community. And some of those same factors, I think, influenced the healthcare sector. The large gifts that we saw going to COVID relief, many of them went to research centers and educational institutions, universities, while some of the healthcare institutions that we're most familiar with, such as American Cancer Society and American Heart Association, a lot of those other organizations experienced less favorable fundraising results because of COVID disruptions and because many Americans turned their attention to areas where they could make a difference. So taken together, this was more of a broad-based growth with many sectors experiencing favorable outcomes. But I also want to mention that the areas that we've seen falter during COVID, this is also a good environment for those organizations to start to think about how to re-engage donors and how to continue to build relationships. Now let's go to the 5th finding. This is one that all of you will resonate with. 2020 saw not just this expansion in generosity, but a catalyst. The events of 2020 served as a catalyst for many non-traditional forms of philanthropy. We saw the rise of crowdfunding and mutual aid as philanthropy of all different types served an important role in responding to the crisis. Based on additional research that we've done throughout 2020, we've seen that more Americans contributed through crowdfunding platforms than have ever done so, and that even mainstream charitable organizations are using crowdfunding platforms to raise additional dollars. One example that really stood out is the CDC Foundation. They raised $50 million in the first few months of the pandemic using a platform called Charity.com. What we're also seeing across the sector is that many nonprofits experienced an influx of new donors. One example that's also very inspiring is World Central Kitchen, which went from a $25 million organization prior to the pandemic to a $250 million organization in the space of 1 year. Many nonprofits now need to build on that new set of donors in order to continue to deliver on their mission and grow. And now let's go to our final finding. And this is probably the one that gives all of us a lot to think about as we move into 2021 and beyond. In 2020, we saw online giving experience an inflection point as more economic, social, and even civic activity move online. Online giving now occupies 13% of overall giving. And this is a new level, a new increase, one that we have not seen before. Just to put this in perspective, when we look back, online giving has been growing at double-digit rates, but it's remained under 10% of overall giving. In 2020, we did see this shift with more donors moving to giving online, with many organizations organizing virtual events, engaging donors online, and building relationships and even community online. And so I'd like to issue one last call to action to all of you in the audience today. The results of 2020 present a lot for us to reflect on, to grow on, but also represent a call to action. Now that we know what's possible, what we can do with the new tools of technology, but also the limitations of technology, we need to think about how we can engage all of these new approaches, as well as the tried and true face-to-face fundraising, in order to build relationships, to build trust, to engage donors, but ultimately to deliver on our mission. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this morning. And also, I'd love to hear your questions, your comments, and importantly, I'd like to thank all of you for the hard work, the innovation, the collaboration, and the resilience that made 2020 possible, and issue a bit of a challenge for all of us to certainly celebrate the successes of 2020, learn the lessons that need to be learned, and invest in building stronger, more resilient organizations in order to serve our communities better. So I'll stop here, stop sharing my screen, and turn it back over to our panelists for the next segments.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Marcy Williams, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Association of Nonprofit Organizations, better known as OANO, and I will be introducing two of today's panelists. First, Tasha Booker, Senior Vice President for External Engagement with City Year. Tasha serves as Senior Vice President for External Engagement with City Year. She has a breadth of experience across Columbus and 28 other cities nationwide. Tasha joined City Year Columbus in 2014 and is credited with securing the first ever school district contract in the organization's 26-year history. With nearly 2 decades of K-12 education experience, Tasha is known as an authentic leader who's been consistently successful navigating the intersection of innovation, social responsibility, philanthropy, and profitability. Prior to her work with City Year, she worked with I Know I Can, United Way of Central Ohio, Boy Scouts of America, and Nationwide Children's Hospital. She has been recognized by numerous organizations, including Business First Class of 40 Under 40, Columbus CEO, Smart Business Executive Directors, Women Welding the Way, and Progressive Women by Smart Women Columbus. Thank you for joining us today, Tasha. Next, we have Judy Huang, philanthropist and CEO of 889 Global Solutions. Judy is Chief Executive Officer of 889 Global Solutions, an international manufacturing company, and her company won the Columbus Business First Corporate Citizenship Award for their continued philanthropy. In 2011, she founded the 889 Global Solutions Fund at the Columbus Foundation. Judy has extensive board service, volunteer, and mentoring experiences. She serves on the board of the Community Capital Development Corporation and is a past board member of Franklin University and Columbus Sister Cities International. She is also a member of Entrepreneurs Organization, Columbus Chapter, and Columbus Capitol Square Rotary. She is a volunteer mentor at the Ohio State University, Fisher College of Business, and at International Friendship Institute Program for International Students at The Ohio State University. Judy earned a BA in marketing from Boston College, attended the MBA program of CEIBS in Beijing, and is currently participating in the second year of a 3-year entrepreneurial master's program through Entrepreneurs Organization and MIT in Boston. She is fluent in Mandarin, Cantonese, and English. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Judy.
Good morning. My name is Deborah Aubert-Thomas. I'm president and CEO of Philanthropy Ohio. I'm here to introduce our other panelist and our moderator. Our next panelist is Charlita Taveras. Charlita is the Chief Executive Officer of Primary One Health, the oldest and largest federally qualified health center in Central Ohio, serving more than 48,000 patients at 12 locations in Franklin and Pickaway counties. The organization has experienced tremendous growth under her leadership, going from a $24+ million budget in 2015 to a $42+ million budget and 310 employees in 2020. Charlita previously served as the executive director of the Multi-Ethnic Advocates for Cultural Competence, or MAC, a statewide nonprofit membership organization. And during her tenure, the organization conducted the first ever statewide cultural competence mental health needs assessment for 13 racial, ethnic, and cultural communities in 2006, 2008, and 2010. And she initiated and worked with 11 departments and agencies in Ohio to adopt the first in the country statewide cultural competence definition. Charlita is the first Democrat and African-American woman from Franklin County to serve in the Ohio House of Representatives and the Ohio Senate. She is also the first African-American woman to serve in leadership in the history of the Ohio General Assembly in 1996, and the first woman Democrat to serve in leadership in both the Ohio House as Minority Whip and Ohio Senate Assistant Minority Leader in 2014 to 2018. Charlita, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And next, let's welcome Sherry Neal, co-founder and board chair for Maroon Arts Group. Sherry formed the nonprofit Maroon Arts Group, or MAG, in 2015 after the death of Eric Garner and Michael Brown weighed heavily upon her. She felt called to bring art and activism together in Columbus. Using art as a medium to affect positive change in her neighborhood is what inspired Sherry to create a physical space for MAG. In 2016, the organization was awarded a grant from the city of Columbus, which offered a lot on the corner of Mount Vernon and 17th Street. This open location has frequently been used as a space to convene, organize, and support her community. However, from this, the box park known as MPAC, or Movement Pursuing Arts, Commerce, and Community, was born. MPAC is a community art space comprising 2 shipping containers, one housing a performance space and a stage, and the second holding an art gallery. Along with MAG, Sherry was recently featured as a finalist for Philanthropist Columbus, earning $24,195.94 towards an arts campus. She's a 2006 graduate of Wilberforce University and has been proudly celebrated there for her accomplishments. Welcome, Sherry. And finally, our moderator, Laura McDonald, CFRE and CEO of Benefactor Group. Laura has served the nonprofit sector for 4 decades. In 2000, she established Benefactor Group to serve the needs of those who serve the common good. The firm works with healthcare, arts, culture, and educational institutions, human service organizations, women's funds, and others as they pursue their vision of a better world. Laura is an astute storyteller and is constantly curious about the innovations in fundraising and philanthropy. She's a frequent speaker at local, regional, and national conferences and has addressed hundreds of nonprofit boards. Her articles related to philanthropy have appeared in Advancing Philanthropy, Nonprofit Quarterly, and other professional publications. As chair of the Giving USA Foundation, she contributes to the annual report on philanthropy, the seminal study of the sources and uses of charitable giving in the United States, and is consulted widely by publications such as the New York Times, Ms. Magazine, Penta Barons, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy. She's a member of the Association of Fundraising Professionals and was named her chapter's Fundraising Professional of the Year in 2007. So welcome to our panelists, and Laura, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Deborah. And I'll also extend my welcome to our panelists. It's a privilege. I'm a bit humbled to be with this great group of women who have a lot to share, I believe. And Judy, I'll start with you. You heard the report about individual giving by individual donors. It increased both giving by donors of their own assets and gifts through their donor advised funds or closely held family foundations, even though it was a very challenging year in 2020. What do you think motivated that generosity? And maybe you can make it most clear by telling us what motivates your generosity.
Sure, Laura. I appreciate the question. It was very fascinating to see the results of the Giving USA data. I feel like I kind of hit a lot of the profiles. So for us, you know, we were blessed during COVID to be essential. So we never really shut down. We do a lot of supply chain management internationally. So, and we were diversified within our sectors that we serve. And then we have a great financial planning partner that showed us how much is available for giving. And for me, several of the categories of faith, education, and research is where I gave. I do feel that, you know, giving has a lot more of a legacy than taking. Certainly that has a much more longer term impact. And that's really what, you know, for me, I'm called to do, and very thankful for this opportunity.
That's great. I also appreciate the fact that you've got a financial advisor who is keyed in to philanthropy and helping you determine the amount and the best way to give those amounts. You know, Tasha, much of the growth in the education sector we've attributed to, at least I feel is attributed to donors who, like Mackenzie Scott, wanted to open doors of opportunity for those who are underrepresented throughout the educational experience. Do you think an organization like City Year can leverage that donor sentiment?
I do, Laura, and thank you for that great question. You know, unfortunately, the pandemic exposed what so many of us in the sector already knew, that disparities continue to exist and persist in the K-12 public education space. And unfortunately, it took a pandemic to be the equalizer. And I hope that the generosity continues as the economy recovers, right? That we don't go, you know, back to status quo, right? Where, you know, there are students, you know, in zip codes who do not have the same resources as those in more affluent, you know, neighborhoods. So I want to be clear about, you know, where some of that sentiment was coming from. And yes, organizations like City Year will continue to leverage that, right? Because we can't go back. Even students who are in affluent communities and schools were struggling, right? From the social emotional damage that was done during, you know, the pandemic. Every student, regardless of, you know, where they live, struggled with online learning, right? Online learning is a platform for some, not all. And City Year will continue to leverage the opportunities that we've had to really lean in. Like Judy, City Year across our 29 cities did not shut down. In fact, we were able to pivot our work and our support of students in schools and communities to the online learning platform. And right here in Columbus, we were serving, City Year Columbus was serving in a recreation center in the Linden community, right? So our work looked different. And that's what organizations like City Year will need to do going forward. We're not going to go back to business as usual in the education space. Many schools will continue the online learning as an option for families. And so we're going to find innovative and creative ways to get to more students across the country.
That's great. You know, I'm giving a lot of thought to how this current experience, the disruptions of 2020 are going to change the nonprofit sector, are going to change the philanthropic profiles. And in many ways, I think that it is the racial reckoning that will have a greater long-term impact than the pandemic, which some might feel was more akin to natural disaster giving. Charlita, it's interesting that in a year when we were experiencing a global health pandemic, giving to health actually declined. Now, there are some reasons for that. Many of the gifts, for example, Dolly Parton's gift to Vanderbilt to help fund vaccine research is counted as a gift to education because it was part of Vanderbilt's healthcare system. Yet it did decline. Was that your experience? And what kind of an outlook do you have for contributions moving forward?
Thank you, Laura. And again, thank you to Giving USA for providing all the information for those of us who are looking at how we move forward in 2021, 2022 and beyond. We did experience a decline at Primary One Health in corporate giving, which is where we get the most of our contributions. Individual donors are a much smaller percentage of the donations that we receive at Primary One Health. But as I look over not only the report of Giving USA, but also what I see in Primary One Health's financials, I think a lot of individuals believed that healthcare institutions, particularly the direct service like us, Primary One Health is a first responder. I think they saw what was going on with the federal government with the CARES Act, ECT, Paycheck Protection Program, and other funding entities that were providing funds for healthcare providers in communities across the United States to get testing conducted, to do contact tracing, treatment, etc. I think where we can see an opportunity for 2021, 22 and beyond is what we exposed very broadly across the country with COVID-19. And that again was disparities in who got tested, who got treated, who died disproportionately, who was hospitalized disproportionately. And I think that's the message for organizations like Primary One Health and other health institutions and organizations, is that we need resources to ensure that the care is given where people are disproportionately negatively impacted.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Sherry, Maroon Arts Group inhabits sort of an interesting space at the intersection of two opposing trends. We saw that gifts to arts, culture, and humanities declined by 7.5%. Arts is part of your name. On the other hand, we saw that there was a real increase, a surge in donations for racial equity and social justice. Did you feel the tug of those two opposing forces? What was your experience in 2020?
Thank you so much, first of all, for having me here. I just want to show my gratitude for that and the amazing panel today. So I would say that I actually would have to say I didn't feel the tug. I think the tug that is something that we've always dealt with. Organizations led by people of color have historically been underfunded, whether it's arts or any other organization. So what we have been doing is just trying to focus on the resources that we do have and utilizing and raising funds where we can to make sure that we can still, care for our community in the ways that we do, using art as a vehicle, and only hope that I think, yes, last year we did see an exponential amount of giving to us because our mission does have a social justice component to it. But we're also looking at those organizations and the folks that did support us last year to kind of revisit and study the fact that to continue to give and to understand that a tragedy or something that happens in a moment in time is yes, people stepped up to give, but we also want them to continue to support the organization, not because of a tragedy. So that would be where we are. And I think the question is more so on the organizations and stewards of the dollars.
That's great. And Sherry, you and I have talked a little bit as well. And even as we celebrate the gifts of somebody like a Mackenzie Scott, and those big gifts tend to have an outsized influence on the ultimate data that we report, there are some other reports that say that the percentage of households that made more modest gifts under $250, increased significantly. I applaud that sort of democratization of philanthropy. And I think your organization is a great example of one that really helps to inspire and mobilize giving from a broader sector than just the top end of the gift chart. You know, there's a lot of data to unpack here, and I'm just wondering from any one of our panelists, if you want to go off mute, what about the report surprised you this year? Did you find anything in it that you weren't expecting or that was contrary to your own experience?
I think the one data point that really hit me was the percentage growth in online giving. I think that my thoughts were that there were still people who are less likely to give online. There's still the mistrust of, you know, whether my information is going to be shared with others, whether or not the software that's used is going to effectively give the money where it's supposed to go. And so that growth really says a lot to me, that there's more trust in online giving than there has been in the past.
That's great. You know, we should do the math and figure out to what extent we can attribute a little bit of that bump to the wonderful outpouring of generosity for the Columbus Foundation's Day of Giving back in, I believe it was back in June. Judy or Tasha, it looked like maybe you were about to lean into that question.
Yeah, I just had a quick point. I was surprised that the health component of USA Giving went down. You know, I guess for me, I saw the wonderfulness of research and dollars and vaccine being created in such a short time. So for me, I actually put more dollars this year. I have glaucoma, which is this disease of the eye. And I funded several researchers, one out of OSU, head of OSU, Havner Eye Center, Dr. Sai Maroy. And for me, I think that's surprising to see that dollars going into health and research has gone down. So that's my reflection.
That surprised a lot of us. And as I say, I think it's attributed to two things. A gift such as the one that you made actually ends up getting counted as a gift to higher education because the researcher is at an academic healthcare institution. The other thing we saw is that some of the national charities that are associated with specific diseases or conditions, you know, often raise their money through runs and walks and rides. Think about Race for the Cure or the walk that Down Syndrome Association does. Those were pretty much shut down for the year. So we think those two elements factor into the decline. Tasha.
No, I was going to add to that too. I wasn't as surprised, I think, about for so many of us, we weren't able to even see our regular physician, right? Our primary care physician. And so for some folks, giving is very personal, right? And they have to have an interaction. And so when you weren't able to see your eye doctor for 8 weeks or, you know, your cancer specialist, because we were focused on COVID, you know, that, you know, creates a tension for folks, particularly in giving. What I wasn't surprised, but I think it underscores what, you know, many fundraisers know is the importance of individual giving. And so what I was surprised by was the individual giving keeping pace and how quickly we are recovering in individual giving. And so, you know, my advice to organizations is to really, you know, continue to cultivate those donors who this may be the first time that they gave, or they may not think about giving again, right? People were feeling very fortunate if you were still working or you had access to resources, people were paying it forward. Again, you know, we need to remember where we were, you know, this time last year and use that to, you know, our advantage with individuals. Someone noted in the notes or in the questions regarding corporate giving, there is a heavy emphasis on corporate giving because they tend to give greater than individuals. But, you know, we know that when their discretionary giving or their discretionary dollars are reduced, so does their giving. Whereas individuals will still try to give what they can when they can, and we need to capitalize on those opportunities.
Yeah, I'm a real proponent of that message as well. We know that 69% of all giving came from individual donors. An additional 9% of giving came from individuals through bequests, so making decisions about their own money, what would happen to their money after their lifetime. And then another 19% of all giving comes from foundations. And we think that somewhere in the neighborhood of half of that is either donor advised funds or closely held family foundations. So individuals making decisions about what used to be their money. So, you know, it's an even bigger proportion than the 69% slice of the pie that we see. But you mentioned another thing, and we actually saw this a little bit. So I'm curious from Charlita or Sherry or Tasha, you know, the CARES Act had a couple of charitable giving provisions in it. One was the $300 deduction, the universal charitable deduction of $300. This year that's increased to $600 if you're a household filing jointly. The other is the fact that the CARES Act put stimulus payments into the pockets of people, sometimes people who were still working and didn't need the money. Did you see any impact from that in the gifts to your organizations?
I didn't see any significant increase in individual donations due to the stimulus dollars that went to individual families. If I were to take a look at who got those dollars and who doesn't do an itemized tax preparation, they're generally families and individuals that make less money. And based on the staff at Primary One Health, who are in some cases able to receive those $1,200 stimulus checks, it's important for them to use those dollars to maintain their basic needs, particularly when it comes to childcare and some of the expenses. Disproportionately, our staff are women. 85% of my staff are women, and a disproportionate number are single heads of household. And so those dollars are going to pay for the things that they need. And I think that's where, when I see the increases in social services and human services organization donations, I believe that the general giver is looking at those basic needs that people within our community need to address.
Sherry, I see you're ready to weigh in on this one.
Well, yeah, I think it's just that for an organization of our size, I don't know whether or not I would be able to discern that just by looking at the general numbers. I mean, we have a lot of people that give, you know, $25, $75 a month to our organization and have been doing so. While we did see an increase in that and an increase in ongoing, you know, people just signing up to constantly give monthly to our organization, I'm not sure whether or not that had anything to do with the actual, I can't make the correlation. So I just wanted to, but we do have, you know, we have seen an uptick in people actually giving, you know, those smaller gifts on a monthly basis.
Great, and that monthly giving is a great resilient charitable giving technique. Tasha.
Yeah, no, we can't make that correlation either with you know, the stimulus, but I will say, was it last year or the year before last when the tax code changed for charitable giving, and we were all kind of holding our breath on, you know, how the itemization versus the taking the standard deduction was going to impact you know, nonprofit giving. And what we know from the data is that did not make a huge difference or a significant difference in those who were going to write checks, who were still going to give. Most people give not for a tax write-off, right? They're giving because they're connected to the organization, or they, you know, there is the, you know, relational proximity to, you know, the issue. And so we saw that, right? Like the question you posed around education, we saw that giving, because even if you did not have children that you were trying to support through the pandemic, you were or somehow impacted by the fact schools were closed, whether you're an employer trying to figure out, you know, how to support your staff, or you have nieces or nephews or grandchildren who were struggling through the pandemic. So that's where a lot of our giving came from. There was this sympathetic, you know, emotion tied to new donors of finally saying, gosh, I just didn't realize how much our teachers, right? So there was empathy towards our educators, but also empathy for our students who were really struggling through the pandemic. And so a lot of our gifts came from the sympathy and empathy of new donors.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Judy, you're speaking from the position of a donor. I'm wondering how the events of 2020, whether it was the pandemic or calls for racial and social justice or the tax policy environment, how did any of that impact your giving? And do you think it's a long-term impact, or that you'll kind of go back to the norm in 2021?
Yeah, thanks, Laura, for that question. I guess for me, again, I was very agreeing to the data that Giving USA had. So for us, one of the big thing that I've learned through COVID is that, we really need a community. We're definitely, as human beings, not in control. I used to feel like I was in control, but COVID again tells me I'm not. And I think that the fact of, events like this Zoom or my church event, or just that community, that mental health, or that surroundingness is so helpful during the COVID time. So part of my giving was to IFI or other faith-based groups. The other thing that was very important for me is education. I have a small fund that gives to Asian students. Alicia out of the Columbus Foundation did a great job. We do remote, again, interview of the 5 finalists of the kids. And a special question came out, how did you deal with COVID? How did you deal with your education during COVID? And what did you learn? And how did you deal with that? And it was really nice to be able to touch individuals that way and to understand what they're going through. So for me, those 2 things are the same. And I think I will continue with those 2 categories because I think they will ongoing make a difference to others.
Right. That must have been so rewarding to actually be able to connect with the students who you were considering for that scholarship award. I'm going to invite Una to come back in and join us. And also, this is the cue that I think we're going to switch to another interpreter. So thank you for your good service, and we welcome the next interpreter. And as we do that, I'll just say that, one of the things that we've seen is that it's unlikely that $300 charitable gift deduction in the CARES Act had a big impact, particularly since amongst households that give, the median giving amount is $1,000. It's also, I've met only a couple of people who took advantage of the opportunity to deduct up to 100% of their adjusted gross income and completely eliminate their federal tax, which happened in 2020, could happen again in 21. But what we did see, and I think Una, I hope you'll expound upon this, is that the other provisions of the CARES Act that really helped to pump up the economy, that led to the rebound in the stock market, that led to an increase in disposable personal income, that it's likely that general economic benefit of the CARES Act is more responsible for some of the favorable giving environment that we saw rather than the individual charitable giving provisions.
Yes, Laura, and thank you to all the panelists. I have very much enjoyed and learned from your reflections of 2020 and beyond. As we have noted, 2020 was truly an unprecedented year. There are many ways to look at this, but one important aspect of 2020 was the extraordinary steps taken by the federal government through the CARES Act. This impacted businesses, the PPP program, the stimulus dollars, but also the support given to state and local governments. If you tally all of those effects together, it's estimated that boosted GDP in 2020 by on the margins of 5 to 10% or even higher. So one other way to look at it is we would be looking at much more dire effects of the pandemic and the economic fallout without the effects of the federal government. And that continues even in 2021. In addition to that direct benefit to businesses and households, we also saw the federal government stepping in with the vaccine production and delivery. And that's another point where I think the nonprofit sector partnered and continues to partner with the government to not just make the vaccine available, but address issues of vaccine hesitancy and reluctance, and more broadly education about COVID, and as many of you noted, the testing and delivery of treatment. So I do think there's a lot to continue to unpack about 2020, but also to recognize that while the tax aspect of the federal government may not have had such a big impact on giving, the other more direct impacts of intervention by the federal government did boost the overall economy and helped the recovery process.
Thanks, Una. I'd like to now introduce colleague Kay Wilson. She currently serves as the president of the AFP chapter in Central Ohio. She's also Impact Director of Community Engagement and Advancement. Kay, there are a lot of great questions that people are putting into the Q&A, and I hope they'll continue to do so. For all of our panelists and for Dr. Osili, why don't you go ahead and share some of the questions that seem to be resonating most with our audience?
Thank you, Laura. I did have a question from an anonymous attendee that asked, wanted to know from Dr. Osili, the stock market being one key indicator for philanthropy, but as many of us are planning revenue projections for the coming fiscal year, what other indicators should we consider, especially during this period of recovery?
That is an excellent question. We have looked at thousands of variables to see which ones are most closely linked with charitable giving. The stock market I've already mentioned, but other measures that closely correlate with charitable giving include looking at personal consumption. How much are people spending? What about savings rates? What about personal income and wealth growth? And for those of you who are looking at local economic conditions, unemployment is also an important factor. And then as you look ahead, one thing that we've also been looking at is what are the factors that affect people's sense of financial and economic security. So indicators like consumer confidence or what's happening in the housing market can be other factors that give Americans of all different backgrounds that sense of security, and that also does drive giving. I should also note that uncertainty has a dampening effect on giving. And what we did see in periods of time where there have been recessions, but also where there's been a lot of uncertainty in the economic and financial landscape, that tends to deter giving. Many donors would prefer to resolve that uncertainty before they make their gifts.
And Doctor, another question for you, given that 2020 was also an important election year at the federal level, did Giving USA or your team look at the political contributions last year as well and how they may have affected philanthropic giving?
That's a great question and an excellent one, one that we've received quite a bit over the past few years. Political giving has grown. It's quite sizable now, but it's a small fraction of overall charitable giving. So keep in mind, giving, we noted, has reached this new level. Political giving is still quite anywhere from maybe $30 billion. So not anything close to the size of charitable giving, and the fraction of Americans who give to political causes is also quite small. So it's 10, 15%, maybe 20% at the most. We have not seen an impact of political giving or election cycles on charitable giving. In fact, what the research shows is that people tend to give out of a different bucket when it comes to their political contributions. And the motivations for giving to candidates or campaigns are quite different from the charitable motivations. Having said that, though, we are seeing more interest in advocacy among Americans and many 501c4s of all different types being able to raise funds. Given the way the tax code 2017, the American Jobs Tax Act, what we've also seen is that because charitable giving is no longer advantaged for many Americans by the tax code, we are seeing some people give more to political causes and realize that they're not going to get a tax deduction from their charitable gifts because they're non-itemizers. So it's something to pay attention to going forward. But for now, we don't see that big impact.
Thank you. Carla Garcia was asking the panel, do you anticipate online giving to continue to increase? She at her organization is seeing a decrease, but she wanted to know your thoughts.
I'll defer to Tasha or Charlita or Sherry, and then I have some thoughts on that as well, if any of you want to add.
I think there are some givers that will look to online giving and continue in that way. But I do think there are some individuals within the communities across the nation that are a little suspect, particularly with cyber attacks and more scams. I think that's where we've got to be more concerned about online giving and whether it's going to grow or decrease.
And I would say, you know, online giving is also generational. It provides a convenience for those of us who have grown to trust the internet, right? So I absolutely agree with Charlita. There is a lot of mistrust because of cyber attacks happening everywhere. And we've given up a lot of our personal information to have access, right? So when you look at some of our social media platforms, we know that Facebook, Instagram, all of those have been hacked before, but yet we continue to engage on those social media platforms. So while there's mistrust, the convenience and access is what, kind of outweighs the mistrust that we have for online giving. Online giving also makes it very convenient to give. If you think about, if you're making a significant gift, you can, give recurring payments through your credit card automatically. You don't have to remember to continue to give. So I think the ease of convenience, ease of use and the convenience almost outweighs the risk that people are willing to take to be able to continue to give.
I think Sherry touched on that with Maroon Arts Group and the those monthly contributors that you've been able to secure, and those are almost always going to be through credit cards. I guess I had a notice in my mailbox last night when I got home about an organization that had been hacked. And, I think by the end of the year, everybody's going to have some sort of protection, privacy protections by virtue of having been involved in some hack by someone somewhere. It's sort of just becoming a nuisance of life. I don't think that it's going to dampen. I think the bigger issue is that, many of the donors who really leaned into the events of 2020 and made new donations to organizations that they hadn't supported before, made those gifts online, we're really challenged to retain those donors. I think that in the best of times, we see that only 1 in 5 donors ever makes a second gift to an organization. Some of that has to do with trends. We see that donors are more loyal to causes now than to organizations. And so, while you might be a child serving organization that they supported this year, perhaps it'll be a different child serving organization they support next year, still within the same cause organization. I think, but it's also incumbent upon us. I think we heard Dr. Osili challenging all of us to, I'll paraphrase, step up our game. And that has to do with, I think, stewardship and how are we engaging those donors? How are we, our response shouldn't be to ask them for a second gift right now, but how are we sharing with them our gratitude, the impact that their gift made, and inviting them into our family so that we can help to retain more of them. I think that's the bigger concern that I have. I do think online giving will continue to grow, albeit that growth might slow and plateau. I think, Dr. Osili, that's typical in economic models. But I'd be curious about your thoughts on that one too.
Yes, I do think that what we saw in 2020 was unprecedented in so many ways. That will step up, not just in giving online, but moving all economic and social activity online. So 25% appreciation in online shopping, whatever measure you choose, you see this big bump. My read on the data, though, is that now that many donors have discovered the ease of online giving, the convenience of online giving, but also the ability to engage with the causes they care about online, we're going to see continued growth. At the same time, organizations have made investments in online giving and online platforms, not just the charities that we know about, but even charities that haven't done that before, such as religious congregations. So going forward, I do expect continued growth. It may slow down, but this is also an opportunity for organizations to continue to make those investments, to reimagine, because right now what we're realizing, it's not just the younger donors that are giving online, as I think a few panelists have mentioned, but some of the older donors donors who are not able to go in person, perhaps to their congregations because of health conditions, that's another reason to make it more accessible for them to give. And one humorous point that I always note is that my father, who's 75 years old, was older than 75 now, was on Instagram before me. So don't discount the power of technology and how people of all ages are starting to use those tools.
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that, Dr. Osili, because I belong to a national women's organization and we have 3 96-year-olds and they are vociferous in their ability to utilize the technology and to use it to communicate with all of their friends and family.
But on the reverse, my mother still goes get money orders because she doesn't trust checks in the mail or anything. So.
So thank you, everyone. I'm going to combine some questions. We had one from Mark Roundtree, Cheryl Klinger, and Sean Becker, all of them kind of touching on what you all talked about and what you saw in 2020. With the surge of new donors, they were wondering what some of the current best practices are for holding on to these donors, if there are any new tools or suggestions on engagement. And then Sean is asking, how are some of you diversifying your revenue? So I think all of those combined are trying to figure out some best practices that you all are either using or seeing.
Well, and Kay, I would point first to AFP and some of the sharing of knowledge that's available through your AFP chapter, through your colleagues who are AFP members. I'd also look to the Fundraising Effectiveness Project and some of the research that they do in identifying some of the tactics that are most likely to yield results. You know, but I will say, I think that this is all rooted in the ability to have a 360-degree view of your donors, which means you need to have a good data management system with clean data in it. So, you know, I think that's where much of it starts. And then we can harness the power of some of the tools that gives us to be responsive to the needs and interests of those donors. The other thing, you know, I said it before, a prompt and authentic and personalized thank you for their gift. Yes, your online giving portal might generate an immediate email that says thank you, or maybe a screen that says thank you. That's not enough. And I would say personalized thank yous until your hand cramps up because you've got so many donors, and then maybe you can begin to think about some less personal ways to thank them. But I would say a personalized thank you for every gift at every level. And then, you know, the other thing that we hear from donors is we hear a couple of things. One is, I don't really know what they did with my money. I think they're a great organization, but I don't really know what impact my gift had. Don't be that organization. Make sure that you let people know that the impact of a gift of $100 or $300 or $1,200 might have in your organization. And then I would say engage them in a way other than giving. Could be as simple as please participate in this survey that we're doing, or, you know, would you add your signature to this letter that we're sending to Congress, or, you know, whatever it might be. Ask them to lean into your organization in some way other than giving before you ask them for the next gift. Tasha, I don't know what kinds of successes you've had in this regard.
Yeah, I appreciate that. What you're saying, Laura, is so true. I was so excited by this question. Particularly, we're talking about new trends, but there's some old practices that we just need to bring back, right? Like, how about using the data that we have at our disposal in the right way, right? Like, we have to move from just having descriptive, you know, information about who our donors are, right? Just the basic information, and really start thinking about how we're using that to advance our organization, right? So moving from that, you know, the descriptive to prescriptive and predictive data, right? And not just using demographics as a way to capture our donors. You would be surprised the number of incorrect mailing addresses or incorrect spelling of first and last names that are offensive to people, right? It's like, I gave you a gift, my name is misspelled, you're sending it to my deceased husband. You know, we have to take advantage of the technologies we have. There's no excuse now for major typos. And so I would say, you know, that's the first tactic. I also think we need to leverage the technology now that we all have gotten accustomed to using over the last year, right? So there are still going to be people who are going to be apprehensive to be in big spaces with a large group of people, right? So your events and all of that may have to feel and look differently. And there you have to find ways to keep people engaged, whether it's using videography now. There's free and low cost resources now to make really great videos of your work. For us, it would be doing a virtual school tour, which we took advantage of with donors. They would meet our AmeriCorps members who are serving in a school, at a particular school online. We'd have the conversation, and we would typically, in a non-pandemic year, do that school tour in person. Well, our schools were not allowing external guests inside the buildings once students were back in school. So we capitalized on being in this virtual space, right? And you can actually get more people in a virtual school tour than you could, in a physical school tour. So I would say, because we can go back into the physical space, not everyone is going to want to do that. And so continuing to leverage the technology that you have to engage your donors.
I just have a quick comment from a donor's perspective, if you guys don't mind. So I guess for me, certainly, Laura, what you talked about in terms of involving the donor, like events like this, I'm very thankful to be among, you all wonderful panelists and the research. So that is very much letting me know what's going on with my money, or what's going on with the actual bigger picture of giving, not just only my own dollars. From the health perspective of the glaucoma, all the recent developments in the research that I've been given, the international friendship, me sitting on the board, and then also for them, the remote situation. When you talk about diversifying your revenue, they used to have fundraising only live, but now they have the fundraising on a remote basis, and they have a lot more donors that came that's remote, and they're always going to keep that remote option open. So I think that's also a point of interesting fact.
Yeah, Tasha, to your point, we were doing a little secret shopper for one of our clients, and so I went to the front desk and registered to be a member. It took 3 or 4 weeks for me to get anything in the mail. My name was misspelled. The name of my street was misspelled. So, to your point, we can and must do better. I will say one of the other things that we're seeing utilized more and more are some tools of artificial intelligence that help us to take, big data and really begin to use it to understand the specifics of our particular donors. So, okay, what's next?
Oh, I'm sorry. If I could just add just a little bit here, I would love to. And when Tasha spoke about just enacting some of the things that from kind of the old school, I think that's what we did. But we actually made a few phone calls and called some people that, from the smaller donors to the larger donors that gave to our organization, and actually thanked them. And I think last year was a great time to do that, because people were not interacting with people in person, and it provided a new and I think hopefully a lasting touch to the person that actually gave to our organization for the first time, whether it was $1,000, $3,000, $5,000 or whatever. We definitely reached out and tried to actually touch the donor in the most I guess physical way possible. We couldn't physically touch them, but actually talking to them and explaining to them how appreciated their gift was, and for thinking of Maroon Arts Group. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Sherry. We've got some more questions about, with the concern about technology and thinking about new cyber attack threats. Kathy Scanlon wanted to know, do you feel that this will affect online giving with people being concerned about the security of their credit card information?
I think people will be concerned about their credit card information, but I think many individuals are really looking at the security of that individual credit card company, looking at which credit card companies have the best protection, or going and purchasing those security lock and those other kinds of platforms that have up to $1 million in protection over your identity and lost revenue or use of your electronic credit card. I think that's where we're probably going to see more people utilizing those kinds of efforts and really finding the best credit cards to protect you as an individual. I know I've done that as an individual donor, you know, particularly for new organizations or organizations that aren't as large. I really want to make sure that I use a certain credit card when I make that online donation.
I think the other thing I would add is for organizations to have their own policy, perhaps around data security, around what they do with donor information, how they store that, how they utilize that. Some organizations are actually putting out a statement that they're not going to sell your information to other entities. But it is more common now for entities to ask, what is your data security plan? And more broadly, for organizations to have that discussion. For smaller organizations, they may need to work with others, larger organizations, to learn from them, but having that data security plan in place is great to communicate with donors who are concerned about security.
Thank you. Jessica Grise asks, are you concerned that the proposed ACE Act will impact direct annual fundraising giving?
Go, Una.
Okay, well, so far what we've seen is that the federal government's actions to boost the overall economy have had a positive impact for different reasons. In the beginning with the actions in 2020, what they did was provide those stimulus dollars and support for businesses to stay afloat. And once those households and businesses felt more secure, they also leaned into the causes that matter to them. And then as we look forward in 2021, I think those actions are continuing to boost the overall economy. Now, there is this concern that higher taxation rates may affect higher income and higher net worth households. But then we get into a complicated discussion of how responsive those households are to the incentives associated with the tax policy and the tax code. And keep in mind that most households don't give for tax reasons. I think maybe it was Tasha that said that. She got the research right. The key is most people give because they care about the causes. And there are some aspects of the tax code that actually favor charitable giving, not just, for example, the bequest provisions. So what I would say is certainly stay tuned to see where the policy goes, but also understand that your organization still has a wonderful mission, and many donors are very interested in supporting it. And working with them to find the right vehicles that provide the tax advantages that they can benefit from is probably the most important thing in this climate. There are many vehicles to use.
I think you've taught us, Una, that while it's not the motivation for giving, sometimes it will affect the timing or magnitude of a gift. We thought we saw that back in 2017 when donors rushed to give under the rules in 2017 before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act took effect in 2018. And so we saw a bump and then a bit of a dip. There are a few things on the horizon that we're keeping an eye on. There's been talk about capping deductions at 28% of adjusted gross income. That was not included in the latest proposal in Congress. And so we were happy to see that from a personal perspective, happy to see that wasn't there because it would have a detrimental impact on giving from high net worth households. We've also seen some attempts to change the way bequests are treated for taxation purposes, that assets that are passed to heirs will be taxed differently. That's just a proposal at this point, but if that comes to pass, we think that that will motivate many to revisit their estate plans and think about making gifts out of their highly appreciated assets to charitable organizations during their lifetime or as a part of their estate, rather than passing them on to heirs because of the tax consequences. And then finally, there are groups that are working toward a universal charitable deduction. The Charitable Giving Coalition, key among them, AFP is involved in that on a national level. And, we would certainly think that a more meaningful charitable deduction would do a lot to help to democratize philanthropy. There are also some legislation about particular aspects of charitable giving. There's a lot of talk, there's always a lot of talk about regulating donor advised funds, sometimes distinguishing between donor advised funds held at places like the Columbus Foundation, where our firm's donor advised fund is, versus ones that are held in the national DAF sponsors like Fidelity, Charitable, and Schwab. Una, you're working with us on some current research, and there will be a new publication on donor advised funds coming out later this fall, and hopefully that will simply provide accurate data to help influence those policy conversations.
The last question, because I think we only have time for one more, would be, with corporate and individual gifts declining but foundations increasing, do you see this as a reflection that many individuals through their donor advised funds and corporations have shifted away from direct contributions and moved to giving through their community and supporting foundations?
Judy, that sounds a little bit like it's tailor-made for you, for your situation.
Right, I felt that way too. No, I really don't find that. I mean, like I said, I contradict that situation. I mean, I, as an individual, have a wonderful relationship with our financial planner. He knows how important it is to leave that legacy. And again, I felt blessed to be essential during COVID. So I did not decrease my giving as an individual. And I have also a small, different fund within the Columbus Foundation. So I guess my personal situation contradicts that question.
May I just jump in and clarify, just to emphasize that the data do show an increase in individuals and foundations and bequest giving. The only part of the giving landscape that declined was corporate giving, and that was primarily because the overall economy declined and many corporations saw a downturn in their profits. Having said that, this is still a very good time to engage individual donors as the economy recovers. We know that more households have disposable income. Same thing for corporate profits. We're seeing much more positive trends in 2021. So this is certainly a good time to engage corporations, but understand that there has been an expansion in how corporations are giving. It's not just through their foundations. It may be through sponsorships. It may be through marketing. It may be through workplace giving programs. So take advantage of all of those new ways that corporations are supporting nonprofits and communities.
I believe that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you.
Great. I think to wrap us up, Kim Horton is going to, there have been several questions, Kim, about how to access all of this great information that's been shared today.
Great. Really easy to do. You're going to go to givingusa.org, and in the upper right-hand side, you're going to see a shop products icon. Go ahead and click on that, and you will learn how you can subscribe to these products. This is a subscription base. In the past, we have offered the opportunity to purchase products. So this is less transactional, more relational, just the way that we like to engage our donors, of course. And it gives you the opportunity to access them year round. So make sure that you visit that website, and we look forward to learning how you're enjoying these products as you continue to do your important work in your practice. And so I'm going to kick it off to Danielle again to go ahead and close that up.
So much for joining us today. My name is Danielle Tong with the Columbus Foundation, and I had the most wonderful opportunity to spend the last 6 months or so helping to plan this event with our lovely panelists and our partners here today. So thank you so much to all of our partners. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, our star-studded panelists today. And thank you to our attendees for taking some time out of your day to learn with us, to spend some time with us, and to learn about the giving trends, both nationally and within our city. Please make note to keep an eye on your email inbox after this. You'll get a link to this webinar along with some additional resources from our partner organizations. And you'll also get a link to a survey and just letting us know how we did today. With that, have a wonderful rest of your day. Please keep this conversation going with all of your partners and colleagues, and I wish you the best. Thank you.